You've been here before, haven't you? That moment when you realize you're explaining yourself again, justifying your needs again, making yourself smaller again so someone else can remain comfortable in their emotional absence. And then one day something inside you doesn't break. It simply stops. No drama, no final confrontation, no desperate attempt to make them understand, just a profound, irreversible silence that settles into your bones like winter. Carl Jung observed this phenomenon in his patients for decades, and what he discovered was unsettling. This wasn't depression. This wasn't emotional exhaustion or burnout. This was something far more significant, something he recognized as a fundamental transformation of the psyche itself. When an empath finally releases an avoidant, it doesn't look like the endings we see in films. There's no slamming of doors, no tearful speeches about how much they gave and how little they received. Instead, there's a quietness so complete, so absolute, that it frightens everyone who witnesses it. Because the empath hasn't become cold. They've become sovereign. And that changes everything. The avoidant rarely sees it coming. How could they? They've grown accustomed to the empath's endless capacity to absorb their withdrawal, to metabolize their silence, to create meaning where none exists. The empath has been the container, the translator, the one who feels for two. But Jung understood something crucial about psychological relationships. He recognized that the empath-avoidant dynamic isn't random attraction. It's an unconscious arrangement, an archetypal dance where each partner carries what the other has rejected in themselves. The empath, who learned early that their survival depended on reading emotional atmospheres, on sensing what others needed before they knew themselves, projects onto the avoidant their own disowned capacity for boundaries, for self-protection, for the sacred no. And the avoidant, terrified of their own emotional depths, projects onto the empath their rejected vulnerability, their exiled need for connection. What appears to be love is actually a mutual agreement to remain unconscious. For months, sometimes years, the empath performs an exhausting alchemy. They give what is never received. They see potential that exists only in their imagination. They create elaborate narratives to explain why someone who claims to care consistently chooses distance over presence, why someone who says they want connection systematically dismantles every bridge the empath builds. This isn't naivety. This is the empath doing what they've always done, what kept them safe in childhood when reading the room meant survival. They're trying to heal through loving, trying to prove that if they just give enough, feel enough, understand enough, the other person will finally soften, finally open, finally meet them in the depths they inhabit so naturally. But there comes a moment, invisible to the outside world, yet seismic within the empath's interior landscape, when something fundamental shifts. Jung called this the moment when the psyche can no longer sustain the projection. The empath begins to die, not physically, but psychologically. And this death happens in stages, each one necessary, each one excruciating, each one bringing them closer to liberation. The first death is the death of hope. Not hope in general, but hope as it relates to this specific person, this specific dynamic. The empath has survived on hope like oxygen, hope that next time will be different, hope that the avoidant will finally see them, choose them, meet them halfway, hope that their love will be enough to melt the walls. But hope, Jung observed, can become a burden rather than a light. It can keep us chained to situations that are slowly destroying us. When hope dies, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the ground disappearing beneath your feet. The empath realizes that hoping for this person to change is like hoping a stone will become water. Not because the person is bad or broken, but because they are fundamentally unavailable for the kind of connection the empath needs. This first death is devastating because it means accepting that love, no matter how pure or powerful, cannot transform someone who isn't ready to transform themselves. The second death follows closely. This is the death of meaning-making. The empath has been a master storyteller, crafting narratives that make sense of the avoidant's behavior. They had a difficult childhood. They're afraid of intimacy. They show love differently. Deep down, they really do care. These stories aren't lies exactly. They contain fragments of truth. But they're also protective mechanisms, ways the empath avoids seeing what's directly in front of them. Someone's actions are telling them clearly, consistently, that they are not a priority. When meaning-making dies, the empath stops explaining away the behavior. They stop translating unavailability into a language that feels more palatable. They see the situation with brutal clarity. This person withdraws because they choose to. This person remains distant because it serves them. This person will not change because they don't want to change. The narrative collapses, and with it, the illusion that understanding why someone hurts you makes the hurt acceptable. The third death is perhaps the most profound. This is the death of the savior archetype, the collapse of the identity that says, I can heal them. For many empaths, this identity isn't just a role they play in relationships. It's woven into their sense of self, their purpose, their value in the world. If they can't save someone through loving them, who are they? What is their gift worth? Jung understood that many empaths carry an unconscious wound that says, I am only lovable when I am useful. I am only valuable when I am needed. The avoidant relationship activates this wound perfectly, because the avoidant always needs something, just never the deep emotional presence the empath actually offers. When the savior archetype dies, the empath faces a terrifying void. Without this role, without this purpose, they must discover who they are when they're not performing emotional labor for someone else's transformation. These three deaths happen quietly, often over months or years. The avoidant notices nothing because they've been conditioned to expect the empath's endless capacity. But inside the empath, everything is changing. And then one day, the signs become visible. The empath stops explaining themselves. They've spent countless hours trying to make the avoidant understand their needs, their feelings, their experience. But now they realize that someone who truly wants to understand will ask, will listen, will make the effort. The exhausting labor of translating their inner world for someone who isn't genuinely curious simply ends. Not with resentment, but with acceptance. You cannot force someone to see you. You can only choose whether to keep performing for an empty theater. The body withdraws before the mind consciously decides. This is crucial. The empath's nervous system, having been in a state of chronic activation, trying to manage the relationship's unpredictability, begins to relax when the avoidant is absent and tense when they're present. Jung recognized that the body holds wisdom, the conscious mind resists. The empath might still think they want the relationship, but their body knows the truth. It stops leaning in, it stops reaching out. It creates space instinctively, protectively. This somatic withdrawal is not conscious strategy. It is the self-preservation instinct of the psyche asserting itself before the ego can rationalize staying. And this is where Jung's understanding becomes essential. Because what happens next is not simply the end of a relationship. It is the beginning of what he called the alchemical reversal. The moment when all that has been dissolved, all that has been given away, all that has been poured out into the void of another's inability to receive, begins to coagulate back into the empath's own being. For years, perhaps lifetimes, the empath has been in what the alchemists called nigredo, the blackening, the stage of dissolution. In the presence of the avoidant, the empath's boundaries dissolved, their sense of self became diffuse, porous, merged with the other's emotional landscape. They felt for two people. They carried the emotional weight the avoidant could not hold. They became the container for disowned grief, for unexpressed longing, for all the vulnerability the avoidant psyche had exiled into shadow. This is not metaphor. This is the actual psychic mechanism Jung observed again and again. The empath, in their unconscious need to heal their own wounds through the other, takes on the projected shadow material of the avoidant. They become the feeling function for someone who has severed their connection to their own depths. But there is a limit to how long the psyche can sustain this dissolution. There comes a moment, often sudden, sometimes gradual, when the alchemical process shifts from nigredo to albedo, from dissolution to purification. The empath begins to withdraw not just physically but energetically. They stop absorbing, they stop translating, they stop making meaning out of breadcrumbs. And in this withdrawal, something sacred occurs. The boundaries that had been obliterated begin to reform. Not as walls but as membranes, permeable but sovereign, open but discerning. Jung called this stage albedo, the whitening, the purification. It is the moment when the empath stops being the container for the avoidance, disowned self and begins to reclaim all the psychic energy they had projected outward. This is not a mental decision. It is a deep, cellular, archetypal shift. The empath psyche, having been fragmented and scattered across the relational field, begins to gather itself back. And what emerges is not the person they were before the relationship. It is someone entirely new. Someone who has been through the fire and survived. Someone who has touched the depths and returned with knowledge that cannot be unlearned. This is what it means to coagulate the self after years of emotional diffusion. The empath who has spent so long feeling everything, absorbing everything, trying to bridge the unbridgeable gap between their depth and the avoidance defended surface, finally stops, and in that stopping they discover something they had forgotten. They discover that their wholeness does not depend on being met. Their depth does not require a witness. Their love does not need to be received to be real. Stop watching. Go to the comments and write, "I see my shadow." Do it now. What follows this alchemical reversal is a series of releases that Jung understood as essential to individuation. The empath must release not just the avoidant, but the entire psychic structure that made the relationship possible in the first place. And there are 3 sacred releases that mark this transformation. The first release is the fantasy of reciprocal depth. The empath must accept, not intellectually but in the marrow of their being, that not everyone can meet them in the underworld. Not everyone has done the work to access their own depths. Not everyone wants to. The avoidant is not withholding depth out of cruelty. They are withholding it because they do not have access to it themselves. Their psyche has been organized around the avoidance of vulnerability, the denial of need, the suppression of anything that feels like dependence or exposure. And the empath, in their unconscious hope, has been trying to love them into wholeness, trying to create through sheer force of feeling what can only be generated through the avoidant's own inner work. This is the cruelest truth the empath must face. You cannot love someone into consciousness. You cannot feel deeply enough for 2 people. You cannot bridge the gap between your inner world and their defended surface through effort or devotion or the purity of your intention. Jung saw this again and again in his practice. The empath exhausts themselves trying to create mutuality with someone who is fundamentally unavailable, not because they don't care, but because their psyche is structured to avoid the very intimacy the empath craves. Releasing this fantasy is not cynicism, it is wisdom. It is the acceptance that love, real love, requires 2 people who are both willing to descend, both capable of meeting in the depths, both committed to the terrifying work of being seen. The second release is the need to be chosen. This is perhaps the most difficult release of all because it strikes at the core of the empath's wound. Somewhere often in childhood, the empath learned that their worth was contingent on being selected, being seen, being validated by another. They learned that love was something earned through exceptional sensitivity, through emotional labor, through the ability to attune to others' needs before their own. And so they entered relationships, particularly with avoidance, with an unconscious hope that if they could just be enough, give enough, feel enough, they would finally be chosen in the way they longed to be chosen, fully, completely, without reservation. But Jung understood that this need to be chosen is itself a betrayal of the self. It places the locus of worth outside the psyche, in the hands of another, in the gaze of someone who may or may not have the capacity to see truly. And the empath, in their pursuit of being chosen, abandons themselves over and over again. They override their own knowing. They silence their own needs. They contort themselves into shapes that might finally earn the love they believe they must deserve through performance. The release of this need is the birth of self-selection. It is the moment when the empath realizes that the highest form of love is not being chosen by another, but choosing oneself. Not as a consolation prize, not as a fallback when external validation fails, but as the primary, foundational, non-negotiable act of self-regard. Jung called this the integration of the self, capital S, the alignment with one's own inner authority, one's own sense of worth that does not fluctuate based on another's capacity to recognize it. When the empath releases the need to be chosen, something shifts in the entire relational field. They stop auditioning. They stop proving. They stop explaining their worth to people who are not equipped to see it. And in that release, they become, paradoxically, more magnetic. Not because they are trying to attract, but because they have stopped leaking energy into the void of external validation. They have called their power back. They have become whole unto themselves. The third release is the identity of the one who feels for two. This is the deepest, most archetypal release of all. The empath has built an entire identity around their capacity to feel, to sense, to absorb the emotional landscape of others. They have been the translator, the container, the one who holds space for feelings others cannot name. And in relationships with avoidance, this identity becomes amplified to an unbearable degree. The empath feels their own feelings, and the avoidants disown feelings. They carry the grief, the longing, the fear, the vulnerability that the avoidant has exiled into shadow. They become, in effect, the emotional infrastructure of the relationship. But this is not sustainable. And more than that, it is not true intimacy. True intimacy requires two people who are both capable of feeling their own feelings, of holding their own emotional reality, of showing up with presence rather than projection. When the empath releases the identity of the one who feels for two, they are not becoming cold or detached. They are reclaiming the energy that has been diffused across the relational field and bringing it back into their own center. They are saying, I will feel my feelings fully, deeply, completely, but I will no longer carry yours. I will no longer translate your silence. I will no longer make meaning out of your absence. I will no longer be the bridge between your defended surface and your disowned depths. This release is terrifying because it feels like a death, and it is. It is the death of the savior archetype, the death of the healer identity, the death of the belief that the empath's purpose is to rescue others from their own unconsciousness. But what is born in this death is something far more powerful. What is born is the integrated empath, the one who feels without merging, who loves without losing themselves, who offers presence without becoming a container for another's disowned self. Jung understood that this integration is the true goal of individuation. It is not about becoming less sensitive or less feeling. It is about developing what he called compassionate discernment, the ability to feel deeply while maintaining sovereignty, to love fully while holding boundaries, to be open without being penetrable. The integrated empath does not close their heart. They refine it. They become more loving, not less, but their love is no longer indiscriminate. It is no longer offered to those who cannot receive it, who cannot reciprocate it, who cannot meet them in the depths they inhabit.